How's this sound? Okay? Excellent. Thank you. So I appreciate you being here today and sticking around for the last session. I'm honored to be here presenting this information here. My name is Matt McFee. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called BriteVerify. BriteVerify provides real email verification services. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we mean by real email verification in a second. But just a couple of housekeeping notes. I have no problems answering questions as we go. So if something pops into your head and you'd like some clarity on it, please feel free to raise your hand. There's a microphone that we'll pass around from the back. And I tend to talk a little bit fast from time to time, so if I'm unclear to anybody, raise a hand and just ask me to slow down. I'm happy to do it. So again, we're going to be talking about email verification today, and towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk more about how email verification drives revenues and ROI for the business. But some of the more fundamental things that we don't really talk about that often even is the fundamentals of an email address. What are the components of it, and why do those matter in the context when we talk about email verification? So I'm going to start with that. We'll talk about real email verification and the applications of a service like this. And then we'll get into the kind of ROI and the revenue side of it. And I'll end with a little mini case study that just from one of our clients with respect to how they use email verification and the kind of revenue implications for them. So let's start off with something that's very basic, and I'm sure we all think we know the answers to, right? What is an email address? We look at a data element, and we can tell that's an email address. But we often don't actually understand what the components are and how they relate to deliverability issues, ROI from web forms, and things like that. So just starting off with kind of the 5 basic components of an email address. You got your username, right? Your username is essentially the location of the inbox at the domain or ISP. It tells the receiver of the email where to put that content, if that content has a home, if that inbox actually exists. Probably the one element that differentiates an email address most from any other data element, right? The @ sign. Substitute a dot for the @ and it becomes a URL. It's not an email address. BriteVerify, the domain itself associated with the email address. And then the last 2, the dot and the suffix, right? So 5 components of an email address. So when we talk about email verification, the most fundamental piece that you should do, and if you don't do it with an external source, HTML5, if anyone's building your web forms today, has verification and format identification built in. So it'll tell the consumer or a registrant if what they've just entered is not an email address, but it should be. So getting into real verification, there's 3 steps, the first of which I just mentioned, which is the format check, right? Is what was just entered, very simply, an email address? Does it have all 5 of those components, that data element, look real, look right? If it doesn't, in web forms anyways, we'll talk about in a little bit, that's the most basic. Go back and please correct it to an email address. Second step, okay, so it's a real email address. Well, is the domain, in this case BriteVerify.com, capable of sending and receiving? Right, so now we're getting a little bit further into the validity of what this data element is. Looks real, and in this case, BriteVerify.com, our domain, is capable of sending and receiving. It's simple stuff, right? So a lot of verification services do the basic format domain check. The reason we call this real verification is because of the next step in the process. And that's making sure that the account or the inbox associated with the address lives there. Right? So the 3-step process, the first 2 of which happen internally. We can determine at BriteVerify or anyone else that does this sort of thing whether those first 2 things are passed. It's the third where we actually have to initiate some conversation to determine, hey, does Matt have a home at BriteVerify.com or at Yahoo.com or at any other domain associated with the email address that's coming through? So we talk about real email verification. The real part comes in because of the account piece. The ability to determine whether the email address exists and there's an inbox. And so when you get down into, and again we'll address this in a few minutes, web form, ROI, deliverability, all these are impacted by that third piece in a big way. It has email verification as a lot of applications. Where we see it used most, very simply, web forms and databases. The most common entry point for any data element in your database, right, is going to be your web form, most likely. So at the web form instance, the point at which that consumer or that registrant is entering their information in, if a mistake is made and it doesn't qualify as an email address or the account doesn't exist or the domain is bad, notifying someone right away, boom, oh, you made a mistake, please correct it. That's one of the most common use cases upfront pre-database. Database level verification is very, very popular for a lot of reasons. We all believe that we follow best practices in email, right? We mail frequently enough. Our ESP is doing a great job of bounce processing anything that gets old or goes bad. A lot of times, though, the frequency with which we're mailing isn't frequent enough. Or we acquired a data set through a sweepstakes program or an acquired company, and that data set isn't as clean as it needs to be. So we see a lot of database use both on our client side, but also on the agency side or the ESP side when they want to make sure everyone is set up properly from the very beginning rather than mailing to a database that could include a lot of stuff that just doesn't exist. So onto the revenue piece, onto the ROI of email verification. Email addresses, certainly from web forms, are going to enter your database. The invalid email addresses from web forms. So if you're not actually verifying at the form level, 5 to 15% of those form submissions will contain an invalid email address in some way, shape, or form. What's driving that, I'll talk about that in a second, is at the high end of that range, 15%, you see a lot of mobile device submissions. So anyone with a business that is naturally moving towards mobile interfaces, you'll see the invalid rates creep up in your database, just coming from simple live web form submissions. Email accounts get turned off. Anyone in here who's a B2B marketer knows this. If you're not mailing your data frequently enough, 30 to 40%, and that's our experience in working with our B2B clients, just natural process. People leave their jobs, companies shut down, email addresses go bad. Natural evolution. You don't see a lot of that, certainly not at those levels in the business-to-consumer space. Certainly the big 4 global domains, you don't go turn off, typically, your Yahoo address. You typically just let it fill up and become a soft bounce. But in the business-to-business world, there's a huge attrition rate each year just in the natural course of business. And then fraud, right? So fraud, we see it through web forms, but we also see it in your kind of non-web form collection methods. Anyone who's receiving a post of data from an external source, whether it be through a lead generation program, things like that. Fraud happens a lot more than we'd like to believe. And so that is probably one of the more frequent ways we see invalid data enter a database is from an external source not coming through a web form and saying, our data's clean, this is good stuff. Go ahead and accept it. And then you're left holding the bag with risk and deliverability problems. The 2 trends that we're seeing push up the invalid data rate, certainly coming from web form submissions. The first one is the mobile growth. Right? Virtual keyboards on tablets, virtual keyboards on small iPhones, no matter how big they are, they're still small compared to a computer, are driving up the mistake rate. Right? So we see 10 to 15% invalid data rate coming through web forms from our mobile users, people that have downloadable apps. Right? The great business model, a really popular app, and it drives 1 million downloads a day. But at the end of the day, a lot of that data coming through that process, they rely on that email address to make money downstream. They're giving a lot away to get you in, but then they want you to buy stuff. That email address is coming through at a higher and higher invalid rate over time. The other one is more non-traditional, non-form website collection methods. Now, we see this in the United States a lot, and I'm sure you'll see it here eventually if you haven't already, which is you're at a point of sale. Would you like us to email you your receipt, or would you like it in a physical copy? So a lot of retailers are starting to push email collection at point of sale now, and now you have 2 points of error. I'm reading my email or verbalizing my email to you, you're hearing it, and now you're hand keying it in. Imagine a non-computer generated submission. Now I'm handwriting your email address and handing it out to somebody else to actually input it into a database. So you're seeing a lot more of these non-traditional methods take hold now, new acquisition methods, and that's driving up the invalid rate as well. So getting to, again, let's talk more about ROI here. In web forms, which is one of the primary inputs into your database. In a web form, when someone makes a mistake that would ultimately have been a dead email when you accept it into your database, and you have email verification working, you catch that mistake at the point of completion. Complete the email field, tab to the next field element, oh, made a mistake, right? Go back and correct it, please. Most mistakes are not fraudulent in live web forms. There certainly are those that are just trying to move through it and give you garbage data. Some will leave. Most will try again and see if they can move through in some other way, shape, or form. But the ones that make innocent mistakes, which is a majority of those mistakes we catch, are going to make their correction. So you kind of move down the life cycle of how you got that person there. You spend some money, more than likely, to drive them into your form environment. And by collecting them in your form environment, you create this lifetime value opportunity. Got an email address, I got a person that's interested in a product where they just purchased a product. Now I've got some communication channel set up with them. All of that lifetime value of that particular email address goes away completely if it's dead, if it comes into your database and is undeliverable. So that's the ROI of verification, and I'll show you a graph here in a second that we charted out, is very, very high, even if you're getting 3, 4, or 5 corrections per 100 through your web forms that would otherwise have been invalid. Number 3 there, the risk piece. There are, and we have seen this, there are fraudulent attempts to enter bad data that then that person or that computer goes away. Okay, so it's not necessarily a silver bullet for fraud, but it does start to tick down, kind of increase the bar a little bit for people that are just trying to, I'm just going to move through this and get the gold at whatever you're offering at the end of the registration process. I'm going to give you garbage data, but ultimately I want your value proposition. So it is actually a good fraud management tool, and there's a lot more that we're going to be doing in the fraud management side in web forms, but for now it's a pretty nice, easy way to add not only corrections, but also fraud management. This is the chart I mentioned a second ago. So the cost of email verification compared to the actual value that comes out of it through web forms is significant return on very little investment. And so these numbers, again, if you know your business much better than I ever will, but if your lifetime value of a valid email address collected through a web form experience somewhere in this range, your ROI is going to be somewhere commensurate on the y-axis there. We see it time and time again with every form user we have. It's not just about deliverability protection in web form. It's about gaining back the ability to get those corrections into a live communication. You've built your email program, you've built your database over time. This is going to help you kind of get that last 5 to 8%, maybe 10% of corrections back into the communication channel. And that's where the ROI comes into it. It's a big, big lift for a very, very little cost. Let's talk about deliverability for a second. So we just talked about web forms, right? Making sure in web forms you're getting corrections, you're getting good data. It's also downstream. It's not the primary value driver in a web form integration, but downstream from deliverability standpoint. Less bad data into your database means better deliverability from the standpoint of data hygiene, data cleanliness. So it's not, again, this is not a silver bullet for deliverability. If you've got a great ESP, great infrastructure, great messaging strategy, you're doing a great job of frequency and removal of soft bounces and everything that the best practices say you should, and your data gets cleaner, it's going to help. But there's a lot of other elements around deliverability that are very, very important. Data hygiene is certainly one of them. Other ones are good ESP, reliable content strategy, managing your database as you mail to it properly. This definitely helps from the deliverability standpoint. So a little bit of cleanup in the web forms helps downstream. At the database level, I'm a new company, I've just joined my ESP, or I'm moving from one ESP to the next. More than likely, you're taking your whole global data set with no bounce logs or anything like that to your new ESP. And so your new ESP now is tasked with, okay, I've got all this data, I don't know what's going to bounce and what's not. Let's spend a bunch of time warming up some IPs and figuring out what we need to filter out, and we'll slowly ramp up to a normal mailing schedule. Verifying at the database level prior to moving that over does help. I don't know if it helps necessarily speed up a process because every ESP has their own thresholds and their own practices, but it certainly removes invalid data from the equation prior to starting the warming up process. So we've heard from clients that it does cut down on the warm-up time. ESPs love the idea because now they know what they're dealing with. They know they have a valid data set as if you had brought your bounce logs from your old ESP. So it's almost like they're starting fresh with some confidence about what they have in their hands. We've also seen it not only from the standpoint of delivery, meaning we're not getting blocked, we've also seen it help with inbox presence. So am I inbox? Am I spam? Some of the ISPs will filter by content, so it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. It's going to be the content that drives that a lot of times. But generally speaking, there's going to be a correlation between cleaner data, better practices, and inbox presence. But it's not just the domains that will ultimately block you if you're mailing a lot of bad data. Sometimes your bad data is diluted well enough across every domain you speak with that no one domain is going to give you trouble, but your ESP is going to have its own thresholds as well. So they don't necessarily want to be mailing data sets that have high bounce rates either. So internally, they're going to have their own thresholds to say, well, if you bring your data set, that's great. We're not going to get blocked. Your IPs will be clean. But We've mailed it. We're not comfortable with it. So it's always important, just from a best practice standpoint, to make sure whether you're bringing your data from one ESP to the next, or you're bringing a new data set into your current ESP from a program you just finished, to make sure that the data is as clean as possible and as free of risk as possible. So we'll just end off here with a case study that we did with a company called SweetJack out of Atlanta, a big radio conglomerate in the States called Cumulus Radio owns SweetJack. And SweetJack does these local daily deals type things, right? I'm sure you've seen 100 of them, and this is very similar in that respect. Some value proposition, but the entire value proposition for SweetJack is generated from email communication. Right, the same thing Groupon does, the same thing Living Social does, and every other daily deals site. They're an email marketing program at their core. And what they do is layer it with local offers so you can engage with retailers and restaurants and that sort of thing. So SweetJack saw the need to make sure that in the form side, they get a lot of volume through this, but just like the mobile app downloads, it's not always quality stuff. People just want the gold at the end of the rainbow. Some just try to put garbage in there and move on. So they had the problem of deliverability. They had the problem of, in some cases, fraudulent signups. But generally, they wanted to make sure that what was coming through their forms was clean. And so what we did with them was our web form API. They just integrated simple integration. I'll show you visuals of what that looks like here in a second. But just simple verification to take what was originally an unverified element, this email address. The old model was fill out these elements, click submit, move on, and now you're on our list. Or you can see today's deal. What they did was add the API, and now able to just simply message if there's a mistake and the email is invalid. The form is going to notify you. It's going to do it immediately. So before you even get into the username or the first name field, already back with a message from the form saying, "Oops, made a mistake. Please correct it." This is just a quote from their VP of Social Commerce on the statistics that came through. So their reduction in invalid signups, fake user accounts by almost 88%. If you want to track that in ROI, it's significant. He didn't feel comfortable putting a lot of those numbers in, but the reduction in bad data coming through web forms was significant for him. And so it's obviously very, very important for any local daily deal site to make sure they're communicating with valid data. That's all they do. They email every single day. So it's important they do it right. So simple form integration, again, back to that ROI chart that I showed you earlier. It's a significant ROI with very little cost and a real easy integration, but it's something people haven't traditionally done. They focused on getting as many people as possible through their web form, and they'll take a little bit of invalid through that. Well, now not only are tools available to make it nice and easy and cost effective, but also the risk of doing it wrong and carrying too much invalid stuff through is even greater than it's ever been.